I think one of the big challenges working on a river and a raft is the idea of capturing the right feel. And I think one of the challenges there is just games so much are about what we in the biz would call agency, the player's ability to sort of make choices and affect the world and control outcomes. And good control is typically responsive control, control where you see immediately on screen the output of your actions. But conversely, like the idea of this big powerful river it's sort of a thing where you don't have control, which if you've ever been whitewater rafting, it's like you're kind of just controlling a little bit, and it's super important that you have that bit of control so you're not just like crashing into stuff. But we spent a lot of time sort of tuning the power, like sort of the influence that the water has on the raft versus the control that you could then push back. I feel like we fiddled with that for most of the project. I think one of the big challenges working on a river and a raft is the idea of capturing the right feel. And I think one of the challenges there is just games so much are about what we in the biz would call agency, the player's ability to sort of make choices and affect the world and control outcomes. And good control is typically responsive control, control where you see immediately on screen the output of your actions. But conversely, like the idea of this big powerful river it's sort of a thing where you don't have control, which if you've ever been whitewater rafting, it's like you're kind of just controlling a little bit, and it's super important that you have that bit of control so you're not just like crashing into stuff. But we spent a lot of time sort of tuning the power, like sort of the influence that the water has on the raft versus the control that you could then push back. I feel like we fiddled with that for most of the project.
You sort of approach these things in a top-down kind of way, and we literally broke up the work in a top-down manner. Bryn worked on the very topmost level, which was sort of the system that just decided at a very, very macro level, very high level, which way is the river going to go. Is it going to curve slightly to the left or slightly to the right for the next 500-meter chunk of river? And from there, I went sort of a slight level down in detail. My job was to take a bunch of island pieces and arrange them within a certain space so that it conformed to the high-level plan that Bryn had built, but also provided interest and the correct amount of density and that kind of thing. And for that process, some of the early sort of handcrafted pieces of river that Chad put together were really crucial. They really gave us an idea of like, what will it look like when these little chunks of island, little chunks of land are put together, are laid out? What will it end up looking like? And, you know, what kind of density of islands and shoreline and so on are we looking for? And then take those pieces and do a lot of nerdy coding work, and, you know, you sort of get this endless river out of it.
Yeah, I thought it was funny. You know, we all went from working on a big authored first-person action-adventure game to a small procedural, non-combat, not really story-driven survival game. Up to this point, I'd been a level designer, making big 3D spaces designed to, you know, have gun battles with guys. And so this is probably like the most opposite thing that I could do.
Coming from a studio where everything was so plotted out on paper ahead of time in concept form or script form, and you're building exactly what you need to see or what illustration the editorial is calling for. And in this case, we wanted some of that, but it was a new way of thinking, how to create environment and how to create a color story and an environment journey.
Yeah, it was certainly the first time for me doing anything procedural. And, you know, I remember just putting together some of these initial islands and thinking about the shape of them and thinking I was being really drastic in the differences between them, but throwing them up into the game for the first time, they all look the same, you know? Like, how can I really accentuate the differences with size and silhouette and all of that while not going too crazy and obscuring the raft if you go behind a particular landmass? But it was really fun to be able to instantly throw them in and see the results, and they were completely different each time.
The water presents all kinds of interesting technical challenges for someone who's into simulation in general. One of the things that we really wanted was for the water not just to sort of carry you uniformly in a single direction, but we wanted the water to actually kind of ebb and flow around the islands and along the shore, and sort of in a way that a real river would. I tend to call it cartoon fluid dynamics because it's definitely not realistic in any real sense, but it kind of gives you a cartoon view of how water would flow through some of these spaces. So that was definitely one of the most interesting problems that I got to work on. And then once you have this underlying physical simulation of what the water is doing at every point in the river, the next thing you really want to do is to be able to communicate that to the player. And that's why the next step after that is to spend some time on water rendering. So the graphics work that was mostly done by Bryn, the other engineer, basically taking this flow information that we generated through a simulation step and making the water actually appear to flow in those directions. I think the way we actually ended up doing it was taken directly from Portal 2. Valve published a paper about how they did their water rendering, and it looked really organic and natural, and I think it worked pretty well for us as well. The feral children have a special place in my heart because they're my actual children, or at least based on them. I brought in at some point a school picture day picture of my daughter posing with my son, they're 6 and 3. I handed that to Sync and said, let's make these some characters in the game, and sort of the tortured little monsters that came out the other end. They were quite different from my actual kids, but I think he captured something of the sort of fierce, almost maternal instinct of my older daughter to my younger son. And I don't know, the two of them have this sort of, they're babes in the woods for sure, but man, are they tough. Man, have they been hardened by this environment. And you kind of get the sense that they're not going to lose to this place. They're going to keep on trucking in some way or another. So I like that despite this kind of gruesome transformation that they went through, they kind of kept some of the character of my actual kids. So they're a big highlight of the game for me.
One of the big points of the game early on is that it would be like a pure survival game. All of the encounters that you had would just be a pure threat that you couldn't really do much about aside from trapping or planning your way around. But over the course of development, something that we learned in early access was that that was frustrating. We ended up deviating a bit from that initial plan with the addition of things like the bow, which fell outside of maybe one of our initial goals in that it was an actual direct damage thing. At the same time, I think we tried really hard to steer clear of a twin stick shooter kind of feel, you know, like we didn't want to do a rapid fire bow. We didn't want people to kind of be rolling through just stacking up piles of wolves. We played around a lot with it, but we did end up creating something that did deal direct damage, but also had a huge amount of constraints. When you deploy it, you can't move, and aiming it is a bit slow and clunky, very intentionally so. And it's extremely costly in that you need to collect a whole bunch of resources for a single arrow.
I personally like the fact that the player spends a lot of time feeling helpless and harried, and then only later, when we kind of give them this rather modest assault weapon, it still feels really good. In contrast to the helplessness that they've felt throughout the game so far, they feel suddenly very powerful.
The idea that you've got a swipe with your staff that will shoo things away and doesn't do any damage, I think that runs so counter to what we've been programmed to expect when you play a game. Like when you play a game, you expect, you know, not only are you going to be able to kill everything that you encounter that threatens you, but you're probably going to get some opportunities to do some sick finishing moves. And to make a game where there's no direct damage right off the bat, there's no sick finishing moves, was a big challenge and such an unusual thing in the world of video games. Which is kind of funny because it's just such a normal thing in the world of the world.
The wolf was the first AI we did. A huge collaboration between Damian and I. I suppose I put together the first prototype, which is a really dumb pawn. It would follow you around and it would run at you really quickly. As it got close to you, it would slow down, and it was pretty dumb and pretty simple. I mostly got it to a place where it was animation complete. Damian would work on it, and I'd find out it was not animation complete. And there was just a lot of back and forth there.
Yeah, I think one of the fun things about being an AI programmer is you end up being an AI designer as well. You have to have a great sensitivity to what the character is intended for, how the character is going to be experienced by the player, and sort of what functional role the character plays in the larger game. In most games that I've worked on, we've always divided characters up into sort of workhorse characters and then flavor characters. And to me, the workhorse characters are sort of the ones that are the most versatile. They're sort of like the meat of your AI interaction, of your gameplay experience. And then you sprinkle various spices on top of that meat for, more infantry, sort of cannon fodder type characters, and then bosses. But those workhorse characters end up being the ones that you see the most and sort of form the backbone of the experience. And so the wolf, for me, that was definitely our workhorse character for this entire game.
I spent a lot of time tuning just how tightly does the wolf turn, and how quickly does it stalk you, and how close does it get to you, and how much can you scare it away. It was hard to know these things going in, and so there was a lot of back and forth there trying to figure that out.
Wolves in video games tend to be characters that just kind of run straight at you and engage you, and wolves in nature are actually much more of a harassing, stalking kind of character, so that informed the way that our wolves behaved. They don't run straight at you, they kind of like hang out on your periphery just outside of your arm's reach, and then when they see an opportunity, they rush in and nip you and wear you down over a long period of time. So that was the kind of experience I think we were looking to create with the wolves.
Magnolia is a character that existed, I think, pre-Kickstarter. One of the earliest concepts of me basically exploring how bizarre we wanted to take the aesthetic of the game and the character art specifically, and also how much fantasy we wanted to infuse into the world as far as magic or the spiritual side of things. I think then we were so fond of her visually, we were trying to find a place for her in the grand scheme of things. I think she went through a number of different identities, potentially being a merchant at one point, a medicine woman, the witch of the woods that might appear more than once and offer the player an opportunity to buy or craft poisons or medicines and that kind of tool.
Just the appearance of Magnolia was definitely like one of the most sort of pivotal or maybe seminal pieces of concept that we had for the project.
One of those that was truly my illustration style. We played around with how we were going to translate that to 3D, and would the character portraits be, 2D, like a traditional JRPG with a 3D representation, which is ultimately what we went with, I think mainly to preserve the illustration style.
I think we did a decent job of translating a lot of your illustration into 3D, but there's nothing like quite the same, right?
No, and certainly what I would have wanted to model her like, or any of the NPCs like, was well outside of my abilities as a modeler. So, it worked twofold. It made sense to keep the illustration in there for style reasons, and also for implementation reasons. It was way easier.
That's the reality of working on a project with a small team, right?
Yep.
Like we all came from a team where, you wanted
I
an
had an
animation.
army of character
Yeah.
modelers that were able to realize this.
Yeah, you want an animation, you can have it like the next day
Yeah.
being mocapped on the other side of the country and like a team of people cleaning it up. Whereas
Yeah.
now it's just like, well, what can we do right now by ourselves for no money? Was generally our means of operating.
Through the wild, between river and dale, touched by the sun, humbled by healed sleep is mercy. Though I've a wave, still I'm begging. Color me grateful for the horizon of day, the breath that I've won and the courage it takes to find closure in the wake of disaster. Oh, to find savior in the way of the water. Steady, steady as a storm, flowing ever present. Through the shadows, beyond the gunwale, the safety aboard a vessel propelled by my own will, drifting away from the danger. Under the willows tree, the sheen of the dew, some laugh at the wind, oh, some cry to their makers, listen to them for an answer.
Something I wanted to talk about with NPCs is just the process of writing them, because I think there was some kind of neat stuff we did there. If anybody's familiar with Twine, it's a tool that people use to make interactive fiction, like choose your own adventure kind of stories that display on the web, and it's really easy to work with. Bryn actually wrote a tool that allowed us to write NPC conversations in Twine and bring it into the engine, which we then hooked into our dialogue system. It was actually pretty cool. I could write logic in Twine and then make things happen, like events happen in the game. So that's sort of how, you know, when you're talking with somebody, they might give you something or offer a trade or heal you. I was rather fond of that. The whole idea of the game is that it's going to be replayable. And I kind of tried to view the conversations as almost being roguelike, in that there's a bunch of discrete choices and you make those choices and you can never go back. Because what I didn't want to do is create a situation kind of like how you might play like a BioWare RPG or something, where you've got this conversation tree, but you're going to mine every branch of it until you've sort of exhausted it and learned everything. What I wanted is people to make a choice and need to stick with that choice, and they get different conversations and options every time they go.
Steady as a storm, flowing ever present. Steady, steady. Feel the skin and know the journey worth its weight in Bye.